Arratsaldeon eta ongi etorri Azkuna Zentruaren izenean.
Good afternoon and welcome. Welcome once again to this International Literature Festival in Bilbao. And here we have the speakers. And as you know, they're going to take us beyond the pleasure of reading, because that, among other things, is the goal of Gutun, Zuria, this festival. They're going to talk to us about creation in the Basque language and its relationship with other artistic disciplines. And what are we going to say about them that you don't know? Well, Cano, among others, has had a very fruitful background as a writer, and the presence of contemporary art is a constant in his work. And Gantzarain has always moved between the boundaries of literature and art. So there's little more for us to add. They are the protagonists, so I'd like to welcome them once again. And a very important thing, on the way out, they will be signing their books. And at 7 o'clock, you'll be able to talk to them at that signing. So welcome, and they're going to start with a round of applause. Okay? Thank you very much. Good afternoon, and thanks for coming. We're going to start with the images. Images are a bit dangerous because since we use PowerPoint, writers have lost their thread. And at one point we thought of not using images, pictures, but the fact is that for the issue we're going to cover, it's going to serve as a support and help. Chundi said that he was once asked to give a lecture, I don't know where, and they asked him, will you bring a PowerPoint or will you say something? Well, we brought a PowerPoint. As was said during the introduction, in Harkaitz work, art has been very present since the beginning. And we are going to take this as a thread, and then we'll see if we can undo the knots. The first book, like Smoke Under the Clouds, well, it's a bit like looking back. This year, it's 25 years since this book was published. Starting with the poem Smoke Under the Clouds, and it started with the publisher's recommendation. The publisher is always the hidden figure, and since it's the first book, you don't know whether it's going to be your first and last book, and you don't know whether it's ever going to happen again, because you don't know if there are going to be any more books. Then you get into a routine and you assume there are going to be more books. But the first book is the first book and the last book, because that never happens again. The writer, Kolga Ruth, suggested that I should use this picture, William Turner, for my poetry book. I was 18 years old. I didn't know William Turner or this painting. And how things unravel. When I went to London, the first thing I did was to look for this painting. And as a young man, you anticipate life through literature and then you remember it. Well, I anticipated a journey, and then I used it on the cover, and I had that desire of visiting Turner's painting. I remember how Gorka sold this painting to me. I had no idea about what to put on the cover, or if I did have any ideas, it had nothing to do with this. But he sold me the idea this way. This belongs to the Industrial Revolution. And it's the picture of a painter that wanted to paint a factory and wasn't able to paint a factory. He started to paint a furnace. He did the bit at the beginning, and then the painter said, my painter is a bourgeois, so I can't paint a factory, I'd better paint a train. But what I liked about it was that it was an unfinished painting, and Turner's painting is very abstract, and you can also see that there's a hair leaping. I couldn't see the hair that crosses the tracks. But anyway, the publisher was very clever selling this picture to me, and the reproduction he showed me was the part on the right, just the train, and not the left side of the painting. And this is a lesson how in fiction and art things are cut out. We're only shown one part and not the other part. And for me, it's true that a postcard or a catalogue has nothing to do with a real painting. But going to London and seeing this painting face to face was a sort of Stendhal syndrome. Well, perhaps not that much, but for several minutes I admired it, and I also saw it in London. And since then, I've always thought that he didn't care what he painted. He cares about the sky, how he mixes the colors, how he extends them. And it's a very suitable painting as at the beginning of something. And the fact that the painting is not completed could be a sublime message. But it took me 25 years to work out the message. But in any case, it's hard to choose things for covers. I would say it's almost easier to make a cover than to choose an image for a cover. The two following books with covers made by me, and Xabier has always brought a good deal of good luck to me. I like sharp, warm colors, and the red color was Marlborough red, and this is where literature comes in too, in the description of colors. Like the description of a hair dye and the names they're given. Terminology is important, and I used a Marlborough red, and the other color wasn't yellow, it was gold yellow. And what was it, 12 years ago, although it seems childish, it was provocative to use red and yellow on a cover. Now it seems quite naive, but then, well, even now. I've heard some comments about it. Because of that combination of the colors red and yellow. You have a theory about it, don't you? That a theory about the Spanish flag and about the colors red and yellow. Well, I don't know whether it's a theory, but for me, red and yellow, when it comes to making something that's alive, are the most suitable colors. For example, for this cover, I knew that I had to use yellow to play a game, and then I remember choosing the color for this book because we had the figure together with Gorka. But John Galiaga liked the color very much, and that was enough. Well, that's curious because John has always talked about the procedure he uses to produce the covers. And he says that if the title of a book is abstract, he uses figurative covers, and the other way around. If the title is figurative, he uses abstract covers. Let's assume a treaty on phenomenology in such and such an area. Well, there he'd use a telephone or an apple. But he would never use a basket of apples, and much less an apple in a basket. So there's the abstraction, and it's true, it works. There was a lot of discussion then in the world of book covers, because many were in favor of not using covers. Gallimard, for example, what he did in his classic cream-colored collection was title, author, and nothing else on the cover. You looked at the book and didn't find a context. And even today, Gallimard, although he still has the old collections, he now shows a picture of the author, a painting. They've found a way of standing out in that fight to make books stand out, because it's not just communication. Books are sort of at war with each other. So in order to defend themselves, Gallimard lost that war. And they had to go to figurative representations. And today, when I was interviewed on Bass Radio, I was asked how a cover is produced, or what the function of a cover is, and it made me think. The cover is there, first of all, to sell the book. But obviously, when you make a cover, you want that atmosphere in the book to be reflected. And you want to condense the book in a single image. And that's so difficult to do. It's very difficult to condense it. But sometimes it's done very well. In my opinion, this is one of the best covers that came out of Susa. One of the best covers, the one for Twist. I bought a catalogue, and there were a lot of pictures of an artist, Dieter Appel, and when I saw this one, it seemed to me that to tell an ambiguous story about somebody that wants to hide, I couldn't find a better cover, because he not only faces himself, but he tries to camouflage his face. And how does he camouflage his face? Through the steamed up mirror from his own breath. And I thought that was particularly attractive. And it was also very easy to cut out. It could be turned into a square, which is our fate. And the hand was important, the hand in front of the mirror. As if it were holding on to a rail or something, with a closed fist. And with this cover, a replica was made. Attempts were made with a photographer to make a copy. It was done, but the model was younger, and it didn't work as well. And that's why we decided to use the original photograph. And looking at this, I always remember other work. This is by Magritte. And it could also have been suitable for this cover. Perhaps not as suitable as the other one, but it would fit in. Borges hated mirrors because it meant a reproduction. Kevin Heredia's cover was based on this. And the twist cover too reminded me of this work by Oscar Munoz. And what Oscar Munoz does is to use an image on those metal sheets. And you can't see it. You look at it and you can't see anything. But when you breathe on it, it appears, that image. And the images that appear, Oscar Munoz is from Colombia, and they are photographs of missing persons in Colombia. And this is what appears when breathing on it. The theme of missing persons. Well, I said, even though it's more difficult, it can be taken to cover. There's a relationship. And poems written with lemon water by Hassonaindia, that invisible writing with invisible ink. And it's a matter of sharing a code, and that's literature too. Sharing a code with the readers, so the readers feel that they have deciphered that code, as they do here with the images. It's also done with words. And about twist again, I've said it before, and I've said it to you, that for me, I'm of the same age. And the world, all the references in twist were what I had experienced. The way we drove around in cars when we were young, my childhood, etc. And this issue of the shared code achieved in literature, I think it's very powerful what the reader feels. And in art, very often, perhaps we find it harder. There's also a message. That's always brought up. Art isn't understood, and it's as if we ourselves make believe that it can't be understood, that it's difficult, as if it were more difficult to share that code. You have some pages in your work, Zuloan, and you say that Chillida and Oteiza weren't easy. More than contemporary conceptual artists, they have stuck, and they became part of popular ideas. And Xabier Mendizabal and others today haven't been as widely accepted, I would say. About Oteiza and Chillida, I would say that in their day, they were different to what we've been told. I don't know where there's a different reading nowadays, because when the Gao group started in the 70s, it as if it was automatic, and I don't think it happened that automatically or that spontaneously. In interviews, they mention Arantzazu, and Arantzazu probably wasn't something that everybody accepted as a beautiful, marvelous thing. And he means the apostles at Arantzazu. It was considered to be ugly architecture, bastard architecture, 14 apostles. And the reading we have today is a reading that has been developed later. I found a calendar from a local savings bank. There was Chiyida, and I probably said the savings bank calendar probably conditioned public opinion regarding these artists. Well, the fact that the savings bank had more confidence in contemporary artists than the public. And playing the role now of an old man, well, things are very different. In 1976, what images do you have? How many images do you have, apart from the calendar you have on your kitchen wall? Well, there was television, but there was 1 or 2 channels, and now there's an absolute saturation. And for an artist to find his place and for his images to participate in a collective imaginarium is more difficult. And I would say that that has also happened. And then Chillida, Oteicia, the work of the artists from those days, had another way of forming part of society, not through an exhibition, but through a logo for this or that movement, another sketch for somebody, and Chillido, the campaign against nuclear power plants or amnesty, then the savings bank itself or the University of the Basque Country. These are images taken from Chillida. But it's true that today those contemporary artists are not as present, when they're much easier to read than Chillida or Oteiza. And there's the subject of corporate brands. I've always surprised by the Caixa logo, which is by Miró. And that Caixa Miró has stood for years, and Caixa has become Caixa Bank, but the logo is still the same. So there's faith there in a work of art. In our case, the logo, the corporate image of Chillida was used by Kutxa in Gipuzkoa, but when the merger took place between the banks, it was blurred. I don't know, perhaps because he's from Gipuzkoa, but the new bank hasn't taken that logo from that artist as something of its own. This is a symptomatic example. What image do we have of Miró? The Caixa logo, etc., but he also did other things, obviously. And I thought that that reflection was very interesting. In Twist, there are also other artists. Twist caught me from the first mention. Boy, its death kept me awake. You pick up the book, and you find this in the first chapter. Yes, if we didn't have these photographs, the presence of Joseph Beuys in the world of contemporary art, would it be as important? No, I think that it's a very strong comment. I like America likes me. He's involved in a sort of carpet, and he's taken on a plane to the United States, and he's put into an ambulance, and from there he's taken to a gallery and is left there living with a coyote for a few days, and then he leaves in a rug, and he had a load of old newspapers around him. I think it was a theme for a monoreality in a gallery, And he mimics the posture of the coyote in this interaction between the two, and his only defense was a walking stick. And I thought that this image was very powerful. Joseph Beuys always seemed very interesting to me, and his personal story and how it was taken to art. Well, his plane was shot down, and then he was rescued in Crimea, and he was saved from death. And in the end, it doesn't matter if it's true or not, because the story itself is so powerful. As the exhibition says here in the quote from Artaud, it's never real, but it's always true. And that can be applied to many disciplines. And he's also worked a great deal with dancing, with newspaper, with felt, and we're going to move on otherwise. This was another possible cover for Twist, but it wasn't easy to cut out and where to put the title, where to put the lettering. Marina Abramovic. And the audio was very good here because there's a video. They have a microphone, and one's holding the arrow and the other one the bow. And if they let it go, that arrow would go directly to the heart. And it's interesting to see how they hold on and how they breathe, because it lasted quite some time. And you can hear their breathing. It's on YouTube. And you can also hear the heartbeats. And I identify with this way of working. Because what we do, or should do, is something like this. We should maintain the tension with our readers, maintain a vibration. I don't know how it appears in the book, but what is art or literature for if it's not for this? And the notion of risk, too, as something that has to be brought into the equation when you do art or literature. Feeling uncomfortable. This is the opening to nudes, and if you want to go into the exhibition, you have to pass between the two naked bodies to generate that discomfort. I like it when I write. Well, here's the book, but you have to go through this opening, and it may be uncomfortable, but that's also something we look for. And there's also a story here. It was a couple, Elena and Ulay, or they were a couple for many years, until they separated. And after a few years, Abramovic, when the artist was prevented, Ulay appeared. And the artist is present. Marina sat at the table, and on the other side of the table, people passed through. And I don't know for how long they had to look at each other without speaking. And there he appeared. The image you've seen, Rosenberg's also in Twist, and I brought this because that picture on the left is by Rosenberg, and I used it. For this work by Xabier Alday, sorry. But did they have Photoshop then? I don't know. I don't know. I don't know what year it's from. I think it's done on purpose. And that's the meaning of appropriation. The texture of the goose with that white plumage, I think it's very different to the photograph in black and white. We must have found it in a book. We photocopied it and enlarged it, I assume, or something like that, because now I see it. I remember that Xabier Aldai's and my proposal was not to use a title or a name on the cover, and obviously the publisher didn't like it. They didn't accept it. But you were almost successful with your book, weren't you? You have the title, the name, but you can hardly see it. Yes, that was my proposal. I didn't want to show the title or the name on the cover, and they said that's impossible. But in this collection, we used the lettering with this kind of wax or varnish, and that's why I propose that we use all black, and that way, depending on the light, you'd be able to see the title and the name or not, and that's how this cover came about. And this is a bombshell, and this part of the book, in this book where Gunther's story appears, yes, this is Robert Lewis, who was the co-pilot of the Enola Gay that dropped the bomb on Hiroshima. He wasn't an artist, obviously. But when he was aware of what had happened, what had they done when they dropped the bomb, his life was affected by it, and so was his mental health. He has spent years in his garage sculpting marble with a very rudimentary technique. And after working on that specific work for many years, he sent that art piece, in quotation marks, to Hiroshima Museum with an inscription that said, "God wins at Hiroshima," and a question mark. Yes, it's curious, isn't it? Yes, it's incredible. And in the next image, we have a frivolous nuclear mushroom. If the previous one was profound, cathartic with therapeutic value, here we see the opposite. A subsequent image after the Hiroshima catastrophe, and we can see that there's a cream cake with the shape of a nuclear mushroom. And a confectioner thought this is a good idea, and this image was taken because the hat emulates the mushroom. So here we see that frivolous reading of that tragedy. Those images that make your blood curl, especially because on the left we can see that blushing admiral, which I think is terrible. And you can see on his face that he's just come from a party with his red cheeks.
Gerora ere egin ditu zea batzuk, ez? Nolabait.
Art has also banalized things like the Holocaust or things that have taken place in the past. And I think that this deserves some thought, because here we have a picture of a Polish artist who's called Libera, that's his surname. And by using some Lego parts, he built a concentration camp. And I think, well, this was shown at the Venice Biennale, and they made him remove the work because what they were telling him is that he was delivering a very frivolous analysis of the Holocaust when his intention was just the opposite. So it's ironical because these things happen in the world of art frequently, and that is that the artist has a certain intention, and then there's a polemic about the work. So that's why they have opinions that go against his intention, and this is in relation to this frivolousness that we saw in the previous picture, and we can see how, well, what happens many a time is that when we see work of this kind, we say that the artist is being very frivolous. But who hasn't taken pictures at a concentration camp? So where is the limit between that curiosity, that wanting to know about things, and dwelling on things that are nonsensical? But look, well, in relation to this issue, there are lots of pieces. And, well, with the things you have at home, you could also build works like this. And this is an element that makes me feel somewhat concerned. And as a child, I loved to play with Legos. And I had a police station made in Legos. And I also had the fire station, petrol station too. But I also had a police station, which was my favorite. Well, I used to play with the Dente brand, really. I wasn't into Legos. I suppose that this is known by most of you. Well, yes, well, perhaps it's this is a work that dates back to 2012, which I think was presented at Arco. And of course, it was the work that really everybody spoke about.
Xabiratzearen eta kontu hori. Gaur egun igual beste zentzu bat izango zuen, alde horretatik.
Izan zen urte hartako Arkoko obra mediatikoa. Pero egoten da Arkon obra bat.
So it was the media work of that particular edition of Arco. You know that the media focus on something that's on display at Arco, and it's either Santiago Serra or Eugenio Merino. And this time it was Eugenio Merino's turn. And this makes me think that there's a division between what you ask the artist to do and what you allow the artist to do. Because what you do is you assume that the artist has freedom and can go beyond all these constraints. But when an artist is provocative, and when the artist does criticize something or somebody, well, you can see that it's not always easy to manage things. Yes, but I consider that what you have to see is how you can set a certain kind of machinery into motion around this criticism of the work, because it always happens, this disparagement of the work, not criticism. And what happens usually is that, yes, you have all this media stuff, but it, well, it's something that has resorted to a very easy provocation. You have discourses of this kind involved in the process. But for instance, what I believe is that this work, well, perhaps with a little bit of help from the context itself, I think that it's known how to survive over the years. And it's lovely to see that Coca-Cola element. And yes, we'll be talking about this later on, but sometimes, or frequently, it is the title that gives a meaning to the work, and in this case, it's called Always Franco. Nothing is said about Coca-Cola, but in any case, you can also see it in the work. And here we have this issue about franchises, which is for ever. Well, these are two possible covers, one that was printed and the one that wasn't printed, and Xabier is going to be explaining why these two covers. Well, I started to work on that idea, but it wasn't really at all clear in my mind. And well, I had a word with Gorka Arrese. He saw things from a completely different angle. And you know what Gorka's like. He sends you God knows how many pictures so that you can give it some thought, so you can give them some thought. And we were looking for an object, or at least that's the impression that I had at that time. And what came along was what I considered the key element of that process, and we suddenly noticed that it didn't have to be a metaphor. And that was the key issue here. So I said, well, okay, well, it doesn't have to be a metaphor. Any identifiable object can become a metaphor. For instance, what I did, I performed that exercise of taking one step backwards, of standing further away. And what I wanted to do is incorporate this into painting, because I wanted to work with paint. I wanted to do painting. I didn't want to use Photoshop, and Photoshop is all well and good, of course, but let's say that painting is equally good. So this is what I was looking for. But at the same time, the subject matter or the novel and the plot on the way this was told and the point in time when it took place offered me a completely different possibility. And that is that I saw this picture by Yvonne Aramberri, who did a piece on Lemoniz. And well, he didn't actually do the piece, but he did have a project. He wanted to do some work on the nuclear power station in Lemoniz that was never built, and he also wanted to play around with some fireworks. So that's why he did lots of documentation work. He went to the files, and what he did was obtain several images that are corrected to those demonstrations that took place against the nuclear power station. And this is one of those pictures. And whenever I see it, I always think about Woodstock. And this is a picture from the 70s, if I'm not mistaken. That was taken during one of those demonstrations, although I'm not completely sure. But anyway, we had these two options at our disposal. And eventually, and although you might seem or might find that this is strange, I chose one and I launched a proposal. And I said, well, this is the cover that I want. And I chose this particular picture. Well, moving on to the details now, it was important for me because on the one hand, it was important to work with that combination of not that common colours. In other words, I wanted to find a lively combination of colours. And perhaps with the risk that it might not end up looking very pretty, but I wanted it to be something very colourful, very lively. And perhaps you might think that this is nonsense, but in the bottom section you can see how there's a little bit more light, and there's an area where the yellow and the red merge or blend into each other, and that is what I wanted to maintain. So that's what this is all about, basically. Yes, I also incorporated an eye. It was a little hole. Well, perhaps I could talk about the cover process, but I think that that would be too much at this point in time right now. But in any case, what was important is that it have the same texture as paints. That is, with lights and shadows and also volume and texture. And what is it? I think that each one can interpret whatever they want. Yes, I think it's Roucher test. Yes, because people see what they want to see, the spectator. And this is going to be the version in Spanish, and if we're going to put in some publicity, well, that's great. Well, this is also related to the cover of Twist, and you can see that there's somebody that's hiding. That's something that I liked a lot, and they liked your cover a lot, but it didn't really fit in with their collection, and they didn't dare use that cover, and I think that this one isn't that bad either. And you can see that there's a tiny hole, and this is where this person is hiding. He or she is hiding behind the record, behind music, yes, and it is pretty. And I'm not sure if you can see this clearly, perhaps it's a little bit too dark, but in any case, this is Gary Colt's horse. And music appears a lot, and above all, well, it's a novel in which you talk a lot about voice, about music, but I think that this image works perfectly well. Because, well, I really like this mention of Gary Colt's horse, because perhaps it's not very well-known painting by this artist, but at the same time I think it delivers a perfect summary. It summarizes the contents and the atmosphere and the novel itself. Perhaps it's not something that you should put on the cover, but it talks about a big failure, about an imminent failure, that has to do with a war context. And you can see this horse, there's no blood, there are no troops. You can see that the horse looks scared in this painting. And the horse is scared because there's a thunderbolt, and the light frightens the horse. The horse is under tension. It's an anatomy lesson, and I think that this is what we also want to achieve in literature, because all of a sudden there's a thunderbolt, and we believe that we've seen everything perfectly clear, and then everything disappears. And when you feel like that as a reader, well, on one page, well, you don't really mind about the next 50 following pages, how good or how bad they are. So I think that this is why we need to have readers that know how to forgive us, because that is what people want to achieve. This is where the beauty of literature resides, and this is what I can see in this picture. And the painting obviously has an advantage in that it's frozen in time. That thunderbolt is frozen in time. And if we were to talk about Gary Colt, of course we should also mention this work by this author, The Raft. And what I would like to say is that with my eyes wide open, the book that we're reading, or that we read some time ago, the book by Gard, well, it has a chapter on this painting that is marvelous. Firstly, it describes what really happened, because it talks about a historic fact, but with all sorts of details, because what it does is reproduce that event with the situation in France then. He describes everything, the shipwreck, he describes absolutely everything with all sorts of details and nuances. And he says, but how can art reflect this? And this is how he tells the story of this painting, how it was painting, and what the figures meant, what the horizon actually meant. And in his sketches, you can see that process, how he places one figure here, another figure over there, how he shuffles the figures around, and how the artist finds the exact way of telling what he wants to tell people. Yes, this is a painting that I included because it appears in a song by George Brassens, and there's a song in which mention is made of a film, and then mention is made of a painting. Well, this happens in the book too. And this is the connection. Because, well, these are the reasons we can find in the different disciplines that come together. And in the same way that Turner did this in London, and Imanol Arrazabal, after spending 5 years in Paris, 1 week before coming to the Basque Country, he went to the Louvre, to the museum. And I said, well, okay, well, I have to make that visit. Well, time flies, and perhaps we will have to close so that the audience can ask questions. Basquiat, yes, the fridge by Basquiat. What are my weaknesses? In other words, transforming into words of art those objects that surround you, or including in the poem anything that happens to you. Because everything has its own story, and you can see that on the door of the fridge. He made a graffiti. They unscrewed a 3-ton door and took it on a lorry, on a truck, to sell it. So people do not only sell altarpieces. And this idea by Felix González Torres, he lost his partner. He rented some billboards, enormous billboards, and posted these photographs of an empty bed. That's terrible. And this is the same idea again. And well, his partner died as a consequence of AIDS. And he says that his saddest memory was that they shared a hospital room with somebody else, and that there was a curtain separating the two patients. And he said, well, dying is a terrible experience. And he said, well, at least having a room in which you have a view, in other words, that you not have a curtain there in the middle. And it's strange how your memory is. And let's say that as a catharsis, what he did was build a curtain that he found the most glamorous in the world. So he also installed this golden curtain and invited you to cross over to the other side, and that's how he told the story. As San Sebastian Yukio Mishima, who was well, mimicking this work on San Sebastian, and you can see that, well, he has an extra arrow that doesn't appear in the original work. And 1 year later, he did the harakiri, and he used that point where the arrow had penetrated. So art also imitates life and sometimes anticipates what happens in life. And in this case, it was the harakiri. And Cassius Clay or Muhammad Ali, the same thing too. When his gold medal was withdrawn, when he was not allowed to box, he was a Muslim then when that happened. But he asked permission to his spiritual leader to appear on this cover as a Christian icon. And this is what we said before. It's that same idea of do-it-yourself. Stiakevich has this work, and in English he says, do it yourself. And this is something that he included in a story, and many people thought that I had made it up. And many people call it IKEA crucifixion. And well, this has several variations, and this is by Nicanor Parra, and I've brought them here so that you can see them. IKEA bungee jumping. Well, this is by another artist, an Argentinian chap, Leo Ferrari. And I think that this dates back to 1965. It's quite old, if I'm not mistaken. And this is from the days of the Vietnam War. And the title is Western Christian Civilization, roughly that. And this artist had lots of problems with the Argentinian church, that is Leo Ferrari. And today's Pope was the head of the Argentinian church. So this artist had lots of problems with the current Pope. And well, courts of justice became involved, and there were many struggles. And one of the works that I really like a lot is this one, and it's called Hell. That's the title. It looks absolutely silly, but I think it was Leon Ferrari's son who disappeared during the dictatorship, under the Videla dictatorship. And the Vatican was one of the first bodies to give support to this dictatorship. And what he said, in a way, and this is something that I remembered at a later stage, but what he said is that you cannot use an idea like hell to put the blame on those people that are missing. And what he did was the opposite. He said, okay, well, I'm going to put these saints in a frying pan and let them burn in hell, because these little figures are made of plastic, and if you put this on top of the flames, the whole thing will melt. So this is how Ferrari uses the Christian iconography, which is something that I like, because perhaps right now he's not that influential anymore. But I think that he's always had a considerable amount of weight in our culture. Well, he still has a significant amount of weight. And this is something that was included in the story. People just couldn't believe it. And it is the dildo virgin, and two things that seem to be incompatible. And the artist said that he used that, thought he's produced it as a work of art, and if somebody wants to use it, well, you can put that on an altar, you can leave it standing up, and each one decides how to use this virgin. It's entirely up to them. Now, well, let's see if we can finish quickly, and if anybody wants to ask any questions or make any comments, well, this is by Santos Legaña, by the way. And, well, this is a proposal that he makes. It's a revolutionary proposal for dead people. It's a funerary work. Well, this was made in metal, in steel, and well, it depends on if the sun is shining, or depending on the intensity of the sun, these shades are projected onto the wall in the background, and you can see the picture of a dead person, and depending on how intense the sunlight is, you can see a clearer or less clear picture. And this is an artist that you might perhaps know. In Germany, there are many thousands of cobblestones like these, and he writes the names and family names of the people that disappeared in the Holocaust, and left them a couple of centimeters higher up, so you always trip on those cobblestones. And in Munich they've been banned because there are some Jews, what they believe or what they understand is that they were trod upon years ago, and people are still going to be treading on us too nowadays. So we go back to the same thing again. It all depends on how you interpret things. So you can understand that there's an initial insult added onto this formula. And this is Esther Ferrer. Well, okay, we'll just open the Q&A session, otherwise we'll never finish. Well, as happened in classes on contemporary literature, this is where the conference comes to a close, and the same thing happens here. John Brossa, a very powerful work. I think it's on display at the Artium Museum. But I think that if you use a good title, it changes a work of art or a book quite a lot. Intermedi, or the intermission, that's the title of this work. And that's how you can justify the absence of the musicians, but they will come back. Okay, if you have any questions, please go ahead now, because we have a few minutes left. Sorry, we can't hear the microphone. You must use the microphone so that we can translate. Yes, I like them a lot because I think that these are visual poems. In other words, we are dealing with these impossible objects, dice, round dice, for instance. And, well, I feel very envious because they really produce a big impact and you can understand them at a glance. So they have something intellectual and something mystical too. Because when we write our intellectual papers, we are always talking about the fact that plastic artists have this other feature because they've always influenced us one way or another. This is what happens with these objects, or with dance, or with the painting, or with music. Yes, art does have that possibility of being able to reach out quicker, because well, many times I feel like avoiding this rationale. But when you're reading, don't focus so much on the words, but focus more on the sounds that are produced. And perhaps this is something that we writers have neglected to a certain extent, although there are writers that are working on this a little bit more nowadays. Any other beautiful slides you would like to see to finish? Well, this is a work by Xabier Zabaleta and the dancer. And this is a tribute to Lassa and Zabala. And we went there to read our texts, and they were playing the piano and showing these pictures, and all of a sudden Xabier Zabaleta showed up. And Xabier Zabaleta, what did he do? Well, there were children there were old people, there were university students, non-university students, all sorts of people, in short. And what they did was something they're going to remember in 20 years' time. He danced the Basque dance, the Aurrescu, as if he didn't have legs. So he danced the Aurrescu without getting up off the floor. And he said, no, I'm going to dance this crawling around the floor without getting up. And he was lying down and people clapped. And we were at the back, and we knew that it wasn't going to finish there. And Consuelo Midney and myself were saying, well, you don't know what's coming now. And in the corner there was an axe. He grabbed the axe and he smashed the trapdoor on stage. He then put his head inside this trapdoor. And what happened is that the stage swallowed him until he disappeared completely. And well, this was a tribute to two young people whose bodies had been destroyed by lime. He found an ideal form to represent this idea, and that was the idea. In other words, this was not the music, this was not the video, it all had to do with movement, because he understood what he could do based on his craft, and he did it, and we were very envious. And the truth is that we were deeply moved. Yes, I still remember that event, I still remember it, of course, and I think that we were all frozen on the spot. And you know that sometimes there are emotions that cannot be described by words. And I remember those things when I'm writing. And what I say is that I want to write to be like Xabier Zabaleta, like a dancer. Somebody said that you can't dance architecture. No, we want to dance architecture. We want to find things like this when we write.
What I like very much reading your books the last few days is a sentence that says, if it's not to think about things you can't think about, what is the use of thought? You can only use thought to think. And we ran out of time. Thank you very much.